Nuclear Association, the International Trade Association, which is based in London. He joined the World Nuclear Association in 2001 and became Senior Research Assistant. His retirement role at WNA is to provide backup for his former role, providing comprehensive, reliable and up-to-date array of authoritative papers on every aspect of nuclear energy, accessible on the web. Ian's a former biology teacher who joined the mining industry as an environmental scientist in 1974. He's author of Nuclear Electricity, the 11th edition of which was published in 2018 by the World Nuclear University as Nuclear Energy in the 21st Century. It's interesting, a Chinese edition has also been published. His particular interests range from technical to the ethical and theological aspects of mineral resources and their use, especially nuclear power. He's written several books on mining, environmental, economic and related issues. Gentlemen, would you welcome Ian Hore-Lacy? Thank you, Ian.
Thanks very much, Simon. Let me see if I can press the right buttons in the right order. Host has disabled attendee screen sharing.
Oh, pardon me, I'll do that, just a moment. Okay, you should have screen share available now.
Right.
There you go.
That's that.
Very good.
Now we need to click that. And I see, and how's that look?
That's pretty good.
That come up okay? Terrific. Well, look, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today, and it's good to see some familiar faces on the screen. Nuclear power, where are we? Short answer is in Australia, nowhere. But let me elaborate. Nuclear power continues to make headway worldwide, with 15 new reactors grid connected over 2018 and 2019, and 15 more expected this year. One of those will be the first small advanced high temperature reactor. Nuclear power remains the only zero carbon source of reliable electricity that is proven and widely deployable. And that recognition is finally penetrating political consciousness in Australia. The world scene has changed a lot since the technology burst upon the world stage more than half a century ago and promised rather more than it has since delivered. At that time, the world leaders were USA, UK, France and Germany, with Russia not far behind. Japan and South Korea soon caught up. Today, the picture is remarkably different. China and Russia lead the world, and only South Korea has matched their export endeavours. USA and Europe are eclipsed, but the USA is making a comeback with innovative small reactor designs. There have been several causes for the huge change in the nuclear world. Government support or interference has been the main factor, coupled with lawfare from green groups with roots in Cold War fear of nuclear weapons. The most important secondary factors have been the atrophy of experience in actually building power plants in USA and Europe, along with supply chain capacity there and the liberalisation of Western electricity markets, meaning that financing new plants has become incredibly difficult. And that's the financing of any large generating capacity, not just nuclear. But let's focus on today. In the USA, there has been an awakening in Congress after 3 decades of complacent indifference to nuclear power. Last year, nuclear-related legislation enjoyed strong bipartisan support in Congress for the first time since the 1970s, and that continues. Meanwhile, the licenses for most US reactors were pushed out from 40 to 60 years and are now starting to be for 80 years. This is very cost-effective for the large reactors involved. The UK is the Western country with the strongest commitment to expanding nuclear power, albeit with little idea how to fund it. Russia learned some hard lessons from Chernobyl and the dysfunctional Soviet era, and is now rebuilding its own reactor fleet and also exporting first-class large reactors to many countries. It's preeminent in this, with projects in China, Belarus, Bangladesh, Turkey, Egypt, Finland, India, Iran, Uzbekistan, and Hungary, mostly well under construction. China is remarkable in the scale of its domestic construction program, mostly of large reactors with some US provenance via France, but also showing up the vendor countries by building the latest model large French and US reactors more or less on time and on budget, while similar projects in Europe and USA have floundered. China's export ambitions have not progressed much past Pakistan. China's 48th large reactor came online last week, giving it a bit over, I think, about the same, about half the nuclear capacity of the US. South Korea snatched a big 4-reactor project in the United Arab Emirates from under the nose of the French, and then built it with commendable speed. But the commissioning was delayed a bit by cultural problems with staff and language. Meanwhile, a new government at home has put a wet blanket on that nation's nuclear endeavours. Japan continues to labour under restrictions imposed by lack of public confidence from the Fukushima accident, despite the death toll from that being 0, apart from those due to government incompetence. It's important to note that the upsurge in reactor exports, particularly from China and Russia, is largely financed from those central banks and seems to be part of a deliberate geopolitical strategy. Financing a nuclear power plant abroad is likely to tie the vendor country to the recipient country for nearly a century. The USA has woken up to the fact that the geopolitical importance of nuclear energy makes it a powerful tool for international cooperation, and legislation to allow financing was enacted a few weeks ago on a fairly bipartisan basis, I might say too. With the cost of all large construction projects having increased inexorably over recent decades, attention is turning to a new generation of factory-built small modular reactors, or SMRs, with economies of number rather than of scale. These are 300 megawatts or less, more or less by definition. Multiple units will often comprise large plants. There are several reasons for this new interest in SMRs. The primary economic reason has several facets. First, successively constructing a series of small units to comprise a large power station means that the first units coming online will generate revenue for building the latter ones, and the total financing challenge is much reduced. Secondly, the more that can be done in factories rather than on site means costs can be controlled much better. The next slide will show that. For the smaller units up to about 60 megawatts, almost a whole unit can be factory built and shipped to site. In addition, at this scale, coal-fired units in an established grid system can readily be replaced. Also, most of these small ones can readily follow loads, so they can be fitted in with unreliable intermittent wind and solar capacity, which our political elites keep encouraging and subsidising. This chart from MIT shows the comparison between economy-wide construction and manufacturing productivity over 70 years. This is not just nuclear, but economy-wide. With manufacturing productivity increasing strongly from about 1980, and that's this line here, and construction productivity that is sort of on-site construction of big projects, declining from 1970. Western world experience with big reactor projects has tragically confirmed this. Regarding fitting new nuclear units into an existing grid system, there may be an obvious saving in not having to upgrade transmission links, and also the consideration that you don't want any individual unit bigger than about 15% of total system capacity in the region. So it's interesting that after decades with little innovation in nuclear technology, the USA now leads the world with an exciting variety of new small reactor designs. And Canada has hitched its policies to this upsurge of creativity. The US federal government has recently opened the way, as I said, to provide finance. So let me briefly introduce you, very briefly, to 9 of these designs, a deliberately diverse selection. Many of them will use fuel enriched well beyond today's 5% U-235, but less than 20%, so well short of weapons grade. Most will have at least a demonstration unit online by 2030. And you'll incidentally notice that they're not all American. First is NuScale. This is a 60 megawatt pressurized water reactor, which has the steam generators inside the pressure vessel. And this is the sort of individual unit here on the right of the screen, representing substantial but not radical innovation on a very well-known and widely accepted base. Its licensing is well advanced, and the first plant will comprise 12 reactor units arranged like this in Idaho. It will be factory built with 3-meter diameter pressure vessel and convection cooling of the actual reactor. And dry cooling is an option for the condenser circuit, which will help a lot in places like Australia. Second is another integral pressurized water reactor, a version of which is now in service in the first of a new series of Russian icebreakers. So it's not just a future plan or dream. This is the RITM 200M, a 50 megawatt, built by OKBM in Russia. It's designed for both floating nuclear power plants on barges and a land-based deployment in remote areas, generally in pairs. This, you can see the scale of it from this guy here. This is the one that is in the icebreaker. And they'll have a 5 to 7 year refueling cycle. And in talking about small reactors and floating nuclear power plants, we need to note and tell the skeptics that one has been commissioned and is now supplying power to a remote coastal region in Siberia. This particular unit has 2 35 megawatt reactors of an earlier icebreaker type. Similar to NuScale and RITM, this is the 125 megawatt Chinese SMR under construction on Hainan Island. It also has the steam generators inside it, so the whole thing can be shipped from a factory to site. Next, a small version of a large reactor, licensed but not yet built, and the 10th evolution of the General Electric boiling water design, in operation now for over 60 years. This is the BWRX 300 megawatt unit from GE Hitachi in USA. It aims to be the simplest and most innovative BWR ever, and to compete with gas, even in the USA. Very different, a high temperature gas cooled reactor with fuel as pebble bed, that is sort of billiard balls, fuel in things, balls about the size of billiard balls, thousands of them, tens of thousands of them. This has several operational predecessors, so the design is not entirely novel. The particular one here is the HTR-PM, with construction nearly complete in Shandong province, China. It's actually a pair of 105 megawatt reactors harnessed to a 210 megawatt turbine. China has big plans for the basic design multiplied in 600 megawatt power stations and deploying them widely throughout China. But beyond that, it will provide process heat at 750 degrees Celsius and takes us towards thermochemical hydrogen production. So these are the actual units, and again, there's probably some humans here. There's a human scale person there to give you the scale. The sixth design is a cutting-edge Russian reactor, Brest. This is a 300 megawatt lead-cooled fast reactor. Russia has taken over the lead in fast reactors, though hitherto these have been cooled by sodium. It has two quite big ones in commercial operation. Brest is innovative in its lead cooling, though Russia has used lead bismuth cooling in submarine power plants. The seventh design dimension is one which uses molten fluoride salts as primary coolant at low pressure. Lithium beryllium fluoride and lithium fluoride salts remain liquid without pressurization up to 1400 degrees Celsius. In most designs, the fuel is dissolved in the primary coolant. This integral MSR is a 190 megawatt one from Canada's Terrestrial Energy. Now, there are about 14 promising molten salt reactor designs, often involving thorium fuels and/or breeding. The Terrestrial considers that these introduce technical and regulatory complexities, so it's sticking to what's most simple and basic. The last two designs are both much smaller and may be called micro-modular reactors. So number 7, in fact, goes by that name. It's a high-temperature gas-cooled reactor called the MMR. This is a 5 megawatt unit promoted by the US Ultra-Safe Nuclear Corporation, but now almost ready to be built in Canada by Ontario's main power utility and be in operation about 2026. The module requires no refueling in its 20-year life, after which it becomes waste. This is the actual module as distinct from the steam generating apparatus. And finally, an even smaller reactor, the 1.5 megawatt Oklo Aurora, also from the USA. This is a fast neutron heat pipe reactor. Its sealed heat pipes convect heat from the reactor core to a supercritical carbon dioxide power conversion system to generate electricity. It's designed to operate for up to 20 years before refueling. Now, I stress that this is a selection from about 40 or 50 small reactor designs which are coming forward. And of course, a few have been shelved on the way in favour of more promising designs. And down at the small end of the size range, there is some military support for them for forward bases. The purpose is to reduce supply vulnerabilities and operating costs while providing a sustainable option for reducing petroleum demand and the consequent vulnerability of transporting that in places like Afghanistan. They must weigh under 40 tonnes so as to be portable by truck or large aircraft, and then return to the USA for refueling after 10 to 20 years. Each reactor must be capable of being installed to the point of adding heat within 72 hours and of completing a planned shutdown, cool down, disconnect and removal in under 7 days. Such reactors would also enable more rapid response during humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations. Russia has a similar program for its Arctic domain. They need to be fully autonomous and designed for years-long operation without refueling, with a small number of personnel and a control centre located remotely. So, returning to the broad perspective, whether with big reactors or small ones, the world needs reliable power that is affordable and does not add to atmospheric carbon dioxide. Small reactors can fit in well with intermittent renewables. In the 1980s, the rate of construction of nuclear plants was well over 30 gigawatts per year. And 30 gigawatts, incidentally, is about, that number there is about half Australia's total generating capacity, just to put it in context. Today, the rate of construction is much less. If nuclear is to play its proper role in world energy provision, we need to build about 1,000 gigawatts of new nuclear capacity by 2050. That means getting back to over 30 gigawatts per year. And the detail is spelled out in the World Nuclear Association's Harmony program that's graphed on the right here. We really need to gear up a lot. So what happens in Australia? We have a few problems. I need to read from the slide this time at this stage. So our picture is 66 gigawatts installed, and we generate about 265 terawatt hours per year. That's billion kilowatt hours per year. So Australia's got a long, contented, laid-back attitude with low-cost coal, and that's now provides over half of our electricity. Nuclear power is illegal in Australia. There is popular support, as you know, for intermittent renewables, which now comprise about 14% of our supply, and you will know of some impact from that on your electricity bills. The cost and impracticality of these at higher levels, however, has yet to be widely understood. At 50% renewables, that's in the supply, not capacity, the delivered cost will be about double what it is now. And there are also questions about reliability of this delivered power from intermittent renewables. For instance, wind capacity factor in Australia averages 31%, solar PV 12.5% of what is theoretically possible from the size of units, whereas coal or nuclear, the capacity factor is typically over 90% online. Hence, they are reliable. So this is a bit of a mismatch between the aspirations of the politicians and voters, and there you have the problem. Now, I've somehow not able to. Oh, Germany. Okay, we've got Germany Energiewende. Germany has set out from about 2001, but more fiercely since about 2010 or 2011, to get rid of coal and nuclear and go all renewables. This is called Energiewende, and it is a disaster. According to Germany's Federal Court of Auditors, the shift to renewables has cost at least 160 billion euros in the last 5 years to 2019. Meanwhile, the expenditures are in extreme disproportion to the results, according to the Federal Court of Auditors president. Scheller is even concerned that voters could soon lose all faith in the government because of the massive failure. And the second part of the Energiewende will be expensive and exhausting, maybe 3.4 trillion euros by 2050. And currently they haven't replaced all their capacity. They're still very heavily dependent on coal. They're still significantly dependent on nuclear, and they have about 1/4 of their electricity coming from this huge program of renewables construction. I'm somehow losing. Oh, okay. Here we are. Just to quote the head of the International Energy Agency, which has previously been fairly cool about nuclear power generally in its scenarios, there is no sustainable energy future in the absence of nuclear energy. So on that note, any questions?
Thanks very much, Ian. I'm just going to unmute all. Now, please be cautious. If you can wave a hand, we'll try and identify who's got the question. If you have a question, could you wave your hand, please? Yes, John Hewison. I think you're muted, John. Can you unmute yourself?
I am unmuted. Sorry, I had to touch the screen. I wasn't waving. I had to touch the screen. That was all.
Sorry, I was referring to John Hewison. I think you had a question, John, didn't you?
Yes. Good morning, Ian. Thank you for your presentation. very, very interesting stuff. And I don't know, I'm probably fairly ignorant in this area. I mean, the notion of renewable energy is all very romantic, but one wonders how practical it is. I'm just wondering, nuclear's obviously got a lot of detractors and probably misunderstandings about it. What are the downsides of nuclear energy in terms of dispensing with nuclear waste and things like that seem to scare most people?
Yeah, well, there's some interesting furphies on that front. Where you mentioned waste. I would, and many others would argue that wastes are the main reason for being positive about nuclear. For instance, if you generated all Victoria's power, electricity from nuclear power, you would give rise to about 150 tonnes of high-level waste per year. Now, high-level waste is simply used fuel, and that can be recycled, incidentally, but if you don't recycle it, all you've got to do is to keep it cool and fuel it. It's not difficult to manage. There's no problem. So in 60 years, there have been no problems on a technical basis with nuclear waste. There are other wastes of larger quantities of lesser radioactive waste. But wastes are really a big plus for nuclear, because at the moment you've got brown coal, you're generating vast amounts of CO2, vast amounts of nitrogen oxides, and a whole lot of other nasties that have to be buried or put in the atmosphere to send across to New Zealand. Another thing is just the whole radiophobia. And partly that arises from some rather dodgy science that was done in the 1950s, and which has now been refuted, giving rise to the suggestion that any level of radiation is harmful, whereas it's now understood that very low levels of radiation, such as we're all exposed to naturally, and which are not, in fact, increased significantly with nuclear power, these are beneficial. And yeah, what else? There's the question of weapons proliferation. No country has, in fact, moved from a civil program to weapons. So these sort of furphies that are around.
Ian, just excuse me I am going to mute us all again, because there is background noise there, which makes it very difficult for the speaker. So
we'll say for the hearers.
I'll unmute you, Ian. I'm trying to unmute you. Why won't that unmute?
I'll click my unmute. How's that?
That's better. Now, who had the question? Chris, yes. Chris, go. You need to unmute yourself. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Ian, on Netflix, there was a program called Inside Bill's Brain, which was about Bill Gates. And the third episode of that was his foray into nuclear power. And he spent a very substantial sum of money to develop a nuclear electricity generating system that used nuclear waste. And he was about to build, with US government assistance, his demonstration plant in China, when Trump decided he was going to have verbal war with Xi Jinping. So it hasn't happened, but I don't know whether you saw that and whether you've got any comment to make about it, because it sounded very interesting to me.
Yes, well, that's the so-called travelling wave reactor, which is actually a misnomer now because they've redesigned it since they first gave it that name. It is one of the many potential designs. It's not a small reactor; it is actually a large one. It's a design that was first proposed in the 1960s, but not actually built. It does have some potential. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily in a front-ranking one. But I haven't seen the InSight program, but I do know of his interest in that particular design.
Thank you.
So-called traveling wave reactor, and it's you can find a bit about it on our website in one of the papers about reactors.
Peter McGregor.
Yes, Ian, you were very dismissive of Australia's position in your answer to the question, where are we? By saying nowhere. Is there any sign of optimism anywhere in Australia?
Oh, yes, definitely. I think we're slowly getting there, and public opinion is split, I think. Younger generation can see no good reason not to go nuclear-wise and not to go in the nuclear direction. I've given evidence that I think now 3 or 4 parliamentary inquiries on nuclear power, one of them last week in Victoria on abolishing nuclear prohibition here. And then again next week for a New South Wales inquiry, and last year for the Federal House of Reps Environment and Energy Committee inquiry. But that federal one was interesting. The majority report from that is a very good document you can easily get, very positive. The minority report from some fairly hardline Labor people, it simply recycled a whole lot of Greenpeace and folklore nonsense, with no, all of which was contradicted in the evidence given to and thrown out by the evidence given in the actual inquiry. So it's a very strange situation that you've got these hardline Labor people that are just digging in against. But the report itself's good. And the other thing that's worth noting is South Australia had a Royal Commission with a focus on possibly South Australia taking some high-level nuclear wastes from the world, but also just looking at nuclear power itself. And there was quite a lot of money spent on that with some expert consultants' reports and so forth. So that's the South Australian Nuclear Fuel Cycle Royal Commission report, and that's also worth looking at. So I think these are indicative that we're moving, but the nuclear prohibitions in Australia came in mainly in the 1980s, basically due to horse trading with the left in Parliament, when nobody at that stage was particularly interested in nuclear power. Why should we be? We've got all this coal, and we've got some of the cheapest electricity in the world, and the government view was that the option of putting nuclear power on the table was not worth maintaining, along with some horse trading.
Cycling.
Do we have any more? Yes, Roger Wilson. Can you unmute yourself, Roger?
Thanks for a very interesting talk, Ian. It's fantastic to hear something that I'm absolutely 100% in favour of nuclear power, to declare my position. And we've got a small group in Beaumaris who talk about these things, and we talk about hydro, we talk about nuclear power. But what my question is how much is the current government interested? You talked about the Labor Party being absolutely against it. And secondly, how much nuclear fuel have we got in the sense of yellow cake in Australia? Aren't we one of the biggest deposits we have in the world?
Yes, Australia has about 1/3 of the world's known uranium resources. And I use the word known because if the price went up and if the supply started to look a little bit depleted, there'd be a whole lot more mineral exploration, as Bill Davis could well underline, and the known figure would increase. But there's no shortage of power, and the second reason is, of course, that that supply is virtually infinite, because if you step up from today's reactor technology to fast reactors, which I've referred to several times on the way through, then you multiply your resource effectively by 50, 60, 70, whatever. In other words, you can virtually stop uranium mining if we all move by the middle of the century, as some people expect, to fast reactors. You can virtually stop uranium mining and just run those reactors on the leftovers from enrichment and on nuclear waste forever and ever.
A little while ago, I read about pebble bed reactors. Now, are
Yes.
they incorporated in one of the many ones you showed us then, or have they lost favour?
No, that's in the second or third one, that high temperature reactor that is being built now in China. That's a pebble bed reactor. I mentioned something about billiard balls, I think, and that's what you have. There's a couple of 100,000 of those billiard balls in a pebble bed reactor that sort of cycle through it. You put them in at the top and you draw them out at the bottom. You assess their degree of burn up and then feed them back in the top, unless they've been expired, so to speak, in terms of their energy potential. So that Chinese reactor is a pebble bed reactor. There are other pebble bed designs around, and several of the high temperature gas cooled reactors are pebble bed. And it's it's a very promising technology. There's also a very there's a 10 megawatt one operating in China now, and I think a similar sized one operating in Japan, but they're only sort of research reactors really. But they've sort of the proof of concept with modern materials, and they look good.
I understand that they're a very safe form of nuclear power reactor.
Yes, well, I think any of those ones that I've shown are safe. In fact, any of the ones that are operating anywhere in the world are very safe. There's no reactors operating that I can think of that I wouldn't be happy to live next to. And that even includes the ones like the modified version, heavily modified version of the Chernobyl reactor, which initially was an accident waiting to happen, which did happen. But look, any of these have further degrees of safety, which is designed, which these days is talked about as walk-away safety. That is to say, if something radically goes wrong, you can simply walk away and they'll shut themselves down. And that's a further degree of safety than the present most of the world's reactor fleet, where you need some active intervention to shut them down. And you then need, of course, to cool them. As we found out at Fukushima, that was the cooling was interrupted. It wasn't the earthquake that damaged the reactors. It was the tsunami that knocked out the generators, which enabled their ongoing cooling. Because when you shut down a reactor, you're still instantly left with about 15% of the heat being generated. That drops to about 8% after an hour. And it was after an hour that the tsunami hit Fukushima, and that 8% of residual heat, which again was decreasing as it was enough to melt the things down.
Thanks, Norm and Ian. I notice Graham Keys, I think you're next, Graham. You had a question?
Yes, thanks very much, Ian, for a very...
We can't hear you, Graham. Can you get closer?
Thanks very much. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks very much, Ian, for a most inspiring talk. The captain of an American warship said to me, "Don't get carried away with the word nuclear. We are, in fact, a steamship. The nuclear reactor is just to heat the water to make the steam." Is that the case in power stations around the nuclear power station? Are they all steam-driven turbines?
Yes. I can't think of any that aren't. There is a proposal for the pebble bed reactors. In the second generation of those, there is a proposal that they will be Brayton cycle. That is to say that the helium that cools them, rather than going into a heat exchanger, steam generator type of thing, will directly drive a turbine, which is what the Brayton cycle does, as distinct from the whatever it is cycle that is a steam cycle. So yes, I think I can't think of any operating nuclear power reactor in the world that is not generating steam to drive the turbine.
Thanks, Graham. Another question, gents? Yes, Ron, just a moment. I'll unmute you, Ron Hunter. Bear with me. Wait for a minute. Can't get you unmuted, Ron. Just a sec. There you go, Ron.
Online now?
Yes, you are.
Good. Thanks, Ian, very much for this update on the latest developments of nuclear power plants. It was very interesting to hear that. Have you any comment on the fact that since the decision was made not to develop nuclear power in Australia, we've built mobile phone networks throughout the whole country and exposed everybody to radiation? How does the telephone network radiation compare with what might come from a nuclear plant?
It's what you mean by the word might. In terms of routine,
come from a
in terms of routine, it's a slightly different kind of radiation, and I'm not an expert on mobile phone type of radiation, but look, it would be totally insignificant. Totally insignificant.
Thank you. Would you like to comment, Ian, on the latest development seemed to be in, or the talk is about using hydrogen. Is there anything on the go in that field that we should hear about?
Yes, that's really a very, very interesting scenario. At the moment, the hydrogen push is for green hydrogen, which will be made from renewable power through electrolyzers. That's the idea is that when there is a surplus of renewable power that is in excess of what demand, then it will make hydrogen. And that's a very popular notion at the moment. You can also have blue hydrogen and grey hydrogen, which are made in different ways. And the question is then what you do with the hydrogen. Well, you can use it in fuel cell vehicles. Of course, there is a big demand for hydrogen already in making the fuel that drives our cars, for catalytic cracking in oil refineries. That's the main, I think that's the main use of hydrogen at the moment. But the whole prospect, and this is one of the things that I'm planning to look at in a bit more detail, the whole prospect of just using surplus renewable power from excess wind and solar doesn't look terribly prospective to me, because electrolyzers are quite expensive pieces of equipment. And I think if you're going to have electrolyzers, you perhaps need to run them a bit more than just occasionally to pay them off. Nuclear power, of course, can run electrolyzers also, either continually or off-peak. So if you, so you could then be running your electrolyzer overnight, making hydrogen. But the other much more significant prospect is if the prospective hydrogen economy, in inverted commas, takes off, those high temperature gas cooled reactors, such as the one we've just been talking about, the pebble bed reactor, and several others, actually operate at very high temperatures. Your typical nuclear reactor at the moment operates at about 330 to 350 degrees Celsius. But these high temperature gas cooled ones operate at a temperature which can drive thermochemical production of hydrogen. And that looks a much better proposition in terms of mass producing hydrogen. So that's one of the reasons for developing these high temperature reactors of various kinds, not just the pebble bed one, but 2 or 3 others as well. And of course, the whole issue of process heat. You get process heat out of nuclear power. You don't get process heat out of wind and solar.
Thanks, Ron. Duncan, you're next, I think.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Ian, for your talk. You made a very good case for the engineering of nuclear power. But I wonder why the public should have faith in the human element, which suggests the industry can't manage itself. I mean, we've had 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl both during testing, for goodness sake. where is the talent coming from to operate these systems safely forever?
Well, I think where it's come from for the last 60, 70 years, Duncan. There's plenty of talent there. There are well-equipped people. But yeah, look, let's just look at those 3 accidents. I mean, 3 Mile Island, yes, that was a major learning experience for the world nuclear power industry. The reactor was destroyed. There was no significant radiation effect on anybody, anywhere. So that says something about nuclear safety. The Chernobyl accident was a fairly new reactor that was being driven by people who didn't understand its physics. And this is fairly typical of the way things were proceeding in the Soviet Union. I think that series of documentary or sort of docudramas recently on Chernobyl underlined that point. That's a reactor that could never have been licensed outside of the Soviet Union. Wouldn't come within cooey of being able to be built in the West. And the Fukushima accident, again, it wasn't so much an intrinsic problem with the reactor, it was the fact that the cooling was cut off. If the Fukushima plant had been built 5 meters further up the hill, you would never have heard of it. Or if they'd, as they were starting to think about doing, had relocated their diesel generators further up the hill, or in the roof of the building even, similar. So it was basically the cooling was cut off. But here you've got a tsunami which killed between 15,000 and 19,000 people, and all we ever hear about is the jolly Fukushima accident, which killed nobody. So it's you know, these things are pretty much an artifact of you know, media preoccupations.
Yes, I noticed you've said if a couple of times, and if doesn't really have a role in high-level engineering.
I think there's a learning curve, Duncan.
And what about when the reactors are ubiquitous in areas of the world that remain unstable and where we have active terrorism?
Good question, and that's one that's readily addressed. But it's a question of what is possible in terms of you know, worst case scenario. You know, even if you had a reactor taken over by somebody that wanted to destroy it, the point is you've got it contained in a solid containment structure, and it can't blow up like a bomb. No possibility of that, because the contents of it aren't able to do that. So the worst case is some release of radioactivity, but even then you've actually got to broach the containment and so on.
Yeah, thank you.
Well done, Duncan. We've got time for one last question, gents. Yes, Jeff Couples.
Yes, thanks, Ian, for your presentation. I'm a bit pro too, but one question that arose out of what you said before, that all of the reactors create steam. Now, one of the finite and even scarce resources in the world is water. So given that it's going up in steam and you're not near the ocean to create some desal, what's the impact on the world and where you can place these things due to the water issue?
Good question, and 2 strands to my answer. Firstly, they're driven by steam, and that water internally is recycled. It needs to be topped up a bit. But when you're talking about going up in steam, you're probably thinking of cooling towers, that's the sort of condenser circuit. It's not the primary circuit, it's not the secondary circuit, it's the condenser circuit. And your condenser circuit can be cooled in various ways. It can be cooled but with a cooling tower, which is evaporative cooling, using the latent heat of vaporization, and that uses quite a lot of water, hence the Latrobe Valley. That's what's happening there. Secondly, you can put your reactors close to the sea. The Latrobe Valley reactor power plants are put on top of the coal field for very obvious reasons. But a nuclear reactor doesn't need to be on a coal field. You can put it next to the sea. And in fact, a large proportion of the world's reactors use water from the sea and return it to the sea a few degrees warmer. So that's not any great use of water. And thirdly, you can use something like a motor car radiator. And that first one that I talked about, the NuScale reactor, in fact, as of about 6 months ago, that there's been a decision to build the first demonstrator of those with air cooling of the condenser circuit. So something like a big motor car radiator, it sacrifices about 5% of the performance, but it uses, which means that there's virtually no water required for the whole thing. And I've mentioned also in passing process heat, and you've just mentioned desalination. There's a bit of nuclear-powered desalination going on in the world as incidental to power generation, but there's no reason at all not to build nuclear reactors purely for desal. And that's definitely very much in the sights.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. And Ian, I guess we have got time for one more if someone raises a hand. Let me see. Are we all done, gents, I think? Looks like we're all done. We'll go back.
Philip Stewart has got his hand up.
I beg your pardon. Philip, where are you?
Yeah, he's here. I've got him.
I've got him. Okay, unmute Philip. Thank you.
Hi, Ian. Long time no see. I'm wondering how in the balance of the production of power by a nuclear plant, the energy required to recover and upgrade the primary nuclear material. How does that come into the equation? It's mining it and then upgrading it to a usable level.
Yep. Well, there's a bit of energy used in the front end of the fuel cycle, that is between what's exported from Olympic Dam and Ranger and what's actually popped into the power plant. And there's also, of course, energy used in building the reactor. But the whole energy return on energy investment, EROI, for nuclear power is very, very favourable. For the nuclear reactor itself, in fact, you get your energy back within 12 months. The energy return is within 12 months, even better than much better than the economic return, even.
Thank you. Thanks, Philip. I'll go through the screen again. Thanks, Barry, for your help there. If anybody can see a hand waving, I think we're all done. Okay, we're all done. I think I'm going to unmute us all. Ian, thank you most sincerely for that update. Gosh, we've got lots of references, thank you, that we can tune into to give lay people an update on the nuclear power, and it's greatly appreciated. So thank you very much. Would you join with me, gents, in showing appreciation for Ian and his lovely talk he gave?
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks, Ian. It's been great. Gentlemen, our next meeting is on the 15th of September.